Last time we talked a little bit about the judgment time cycles, particularly curse time. There are many, of course. We can't deal with all of them in just a couple of sessions, but it's good to know how curse time works. And I really don't like calling it curse time, because having been there myself, I realize that it's a grace period. From the time that the judgment is, or the sentence is passed, until the time of the actual execution of judgment, God always, in His mercy, grants a grace period for repentance. That's something that I learned by personal experience as well. And in fact, I learned it before I even knew what curse time was. It took me 10 years to figure it out, but when I went back to my records, I realized what had actually had happened. The idea of curse time, by the way, was first conceived of by Revelation in 1946. The man who discovered it was actually a trapeze artist for Barnum and Bailey Circus in the early 1900s. So he was flying high, I'm sure. But he discovered it just by looking at the chronology between Adam and the flood, from Adam to Noah, and discovered that it was 1,656 years by biblical chronological history between the curse of Adam, curse upon the ground for Adam's sake, until the flood actually came and essentially fulfilled the judgment from that curse. Meanwhile, there was 1656 years, which is 4 cycles of 414 years. Now that was the only thing that the only example that he had. And he actually came up with this revelation of curse time and blessed time being 490, and of course judge time being 434, judge time for late obedience. And so he didn't really know what to do with it beyond that. But his son, Lalo Cadona, has anybody ever heard him?
I've heard about him.
That's all? Boy, he wasn't very well known, was he? Okay, well, Lalo was his son. I met him in 1991, in February, but who's counting? He was in Batesville, Arkansas to do some meetings, and I went and I heard him and got his chronology and so on. But he was a little handicapped because his chronology was a little off, and so he never discovered any more curse time cycles. But I went home and I started studying, and within a few months, I had found 6 major cycles in Scripture, which suddenly opened up everything and really provided a substantial knowledge and understanding of what curse time was. And so that's how it started back in 1991, and out of that came my book, Secrets of Time. Now, so I was talking about that a bit yesterday, but I want to move on from there. Remember, if you recall, I ended with the idea that the judgment cycles upon the world, really, but it was really on account of Israel's sin and Judah's sin, long-term beast systems where God put the earth under the dominion of these beast systems and took it away from the monarchs of Judah because of their corruption and rebellion. And we have now come through all of that long-term judgment cycles, and as of 2017, we have emerged out of this, at least for the most part. There's still some further long-term cycles that'll go through the next century, but who's counting? We'll let the next century take care of itself. But the point is that if you know who you are, you can step into that position because God, I know, has trained at least most of you for a long, long time in how to exercise the dominion mandate, how to exercise dominion in the earth, which is the dominion mandate given to Adam way, way back in the first chapter of Genesis. He said, let them have dominion. But that was only half of the birthright. The other half is the fruitfulness mandate. The dominion gives you the authority, but it's the authority to do what? It's the authority to bring forth fruit. The fruit is the responsibility that comes with the authority. You got that? The bringing forth fruit is what we are responsible to do as a result of having the authority. Authority and responsibility always have to go in equal measures. To whatever extent you have dominion or authority in your calling, that is the extent to which you are authorized. That's the extent of your responsibility. A tyrant wants dominion without having to be responsible for his actions. And other people, well, they just misuse their authority, and or some people are being scapegoated where they become responsible for the misdeeds of the one in authority, right? It happens all the time in business, especially here in America. That's the American way, I think. That's something that needs to change. The sons of God need to understand how to exercise authority properly and to take responsibility for their actions, take responsibility for their full level of authority. They always have to go in equal measures, otherwise you have injustice somewhere. Now, if you know yourself, you know who you are, it becomes applicable in many, many different ways and many different ministries. I've been in deliverance ministry on occasion, and we found that the key is to know who you are. If you don't know who you are, if you don't know that beyond any doubt that you are a child of God, then you don't really have confidence in the authority that you really have as sons of God. And if you don't really have that confidence, those demonic forces will shake your faith. They'll laugh at you, and they'll pretend like they have the upper hand, and it can freak you out. Believe me, I've been there. But once I understood who I was, then it didn't matter what they said. I would just say, "What? Are you still here? May I remind you of who I am? You have no right to be here because I'm casting you out." Well, once they really are convinced that you know who you are, it's a breeze after that. So, it's the same thing in exercising dominion in other ways. You may not ever go into politics and have dominion in that realm, but you can have dominion in many other realms. You have people with gifts of healing that have dominion over certain diseases or conditions, or maybe all disease. I don't know. You have other people who have dominion in other areas, finances or whatever. You see, whatever calling you have dominion in that area. That is what a calling is. And you're responsible then to fulfill whatever calling you have. We all have different callings, but there's really the five major categories of callings, the fivefold ministry. But under each of them, there's individual callings that fall under any one of those characteristics or one of those fivefold ministries. But all of them have to do with having dominion in your particular area. And it doesn't matter what it is. If that is your area, that's the most important thing in your life. Develop that, and you can't go wrong. Right? All right. Now, the problem is that the big problem is, how do we change over from being a son of Adam to a son of God? Okay? Some people say, well, if you're a son of Adam, you are a son of God, because you can look at Luke chapter 3, the last verse, where it talks about Adam, who was a son of God. Well, that's true. Yeah, when he was created, but when he sinned, he lost something. And now, when we come to the New Testament, in the first chapter of John, we find that there's a process by which we may become the sons of God. In other words, that implies we are not the sons of God until a certain process has taken place. And John gives you the pattern of how to become the sons of God. It's really reattaining the position that was lost in Adam when Adam sinned. So you can't just go to your genealogy and say, I'm a son of Adam, therefore I am a son of God. It doesn't work that way, because if you're a son of Adam, you're under the same curse that Adam was. We are who we say we are. When the divine court is seated and asks you, who are you? You say, well, who is not my name? But if you have to identify yourself. Who are you? You have to know who you are. Because if you say, oh, I'm a son of Adam, oh, you're one of those under the curse. Right? How are you going to find salvation or justification with God? How are you going to come into right standing with God as a son of Adam? Well, you've got to look at the book of John to find that out, because you have to switch your identity, and you have to become a son of God to have standing in the divine court, to have authority to act on his behalf. So your genealogy, your fleshly genealogy, is insufficient to do that. We do not have standing other than being under the curse by our flesh and blood. And that's why Paul says, flesh and blood shall not inherit the kingdom of God. The real question is, how do you become an inheritor? Now, when Israel came out of Egypt, they came out of Egypt, and then they were established, the kingdom was established at Mount Sinai. They entered the kingdom under Joshua 40 years later. They inherited the kingdom 7 years after that. So just because you have established the kingdom doesn't mean you have entered the kingdom, nor does it mean you have inherited the kingdom. These are separate things. They're all related. But it's a three-step process, really four, if you consider coming out of Egypt as the first step. Now, you become a son of God by coming out of Egypt. If you go back, let's look at Exodus chapter 12. And we're going to work our way into Tabernacles here to make it appropriate for the feast that we are celebrating here. But in Exodus 12, it's the chapter about the instructions about the Feast of Passover. And you'll notice a few things. We won't get into all of it. Most of you know this anyway. But the one point I want to make is in verse 19. Well, I guess let's go before that just a little bit. Passover was a time when the firstborn sons of man or beast of the Egyptians were slain because Egypt refused to let God's firstborn son get born out of Egypt. Okay, that makes sense? So because he refused to allow these people to be the firstborn sons of God and to exercise their rights under God as with as sons of God, they then became liable because they were in a position of authority. See, if somebody in authority over you refuses to allow you to fulfill your calling, that authority takes upon themselves the curse for your not coming into your calling. It's not you, it's them. That's a simple principle. authority brings responsibility. And when somebody does not allow you to fulfill your calling, they take that responsibility upon themselves, and it becomes a curse to them. Pharaoh got that curse because he refused to allow Israel to fulfill its calling. And so therefore, they lost their firstborn sons. But it's about sonship. It's about the firstborn sons of God. It's about the inheritors. Now, the problem, which is what we talked about a little earlier, or yesterday it was that a year ago? So much has happened already in between. But what happened was that, I lost my train of thought. What was my train of thought? I was almost killed when a train of thought went through my mind. Egypt's firstborn son. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Lose your calling. You're prevented to lose your calling.
That's right. Okay. You take the curse.
I was the only one who did that.
Yeah. I have found in my own experience, there was a man once who swore that he would see to it I never got it back into the ministry. And he said, over my dead body. It happened. He took responsibility for my calling, and it put him on cursed time. Took 3 cycles of 414 days. Anyway, I don't tell that story very often because I feel really bad about that. But anyway, when you go through these things, you begin to understand it because it becomes part of your personal history. What you've seen and heard, you testify what you have seen and heard. And so I've learned these things through personal experience, and sometimes it hasn't been a very pretty sight. But nonetheless, we learn. Now, at Passover, at the original Passover, a point that I want to make is in verse 19 at the end of it. This is about unleavened bread. Of course, Passover is the first day of unleavened bread, so there's a 7-day time frame here of unleavened bread. So Passover isn't just one day, it really is extended for a whole week. So it says, 7 days shall there be no leaven found in your houses, for whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation, and by the way, that's the word church, of Israel, whether he is an alien or a native of the land. Now, here in this, in Exodus 12, the provision is made where it says, it quite literally says that that only Israelites can partake of the Passover. And then it talks about how if the alien wants to do it, then in those days, he had to partake of the covenant. In other words, in those days, it was physical circumcision, and then he could take or eat the Passover meal, whether he is an Israelite or not, a native or an alien or whatever, anything. Some people say that only Israelites can be saved or justified by faith, which is what Passover is. Well, technically that's true. But it doesn't exclude anybody, because anybody can become an Israelite. You just have to do it in the legal process. Now, you can't change your genealogy, your fleshly genealogy. That, of course, we're born with that. And unless you're a modern geneticist and you do some wheeling and dealing with the genes and things, you really can't change your genealogy. But that's not the point. There's a difference between genealogy and law. You have lawful standing, or you have biological standing. And the Bible deals mostly with your lawful standing. And by the lawful standing, you can become an Israelite just in those days by physical circumcision, by today's standards, by heart circumcision, because we're under a different covenant, a new covenant, not the old covenant. Physical circumcision is all about a sign of the old covenant, but the sign of the new covenant is for the heart circumcision. And you can read that in Romans 2:28 and 29. The Apostle Paul expounds a lot on that, because that was kind of the big issue in his day. Well, so in other words, the Feast of Passover is all about becoming the firstborn sons of God as a group, as a nation. And so when God called Israel out of Egypt, it says, out of Egypt have I called my son. And it's all about the firstborn sons, which were meant to inherit. But that's just the birthing of those sons. When you experience Passover in a new covenant manner, where you keep it right here, you have to keep the feast in the place where he has placed his name, right? Yes. That's the law, Deuteronomy 16. The only lawful place to keep a feast is in the place where he has chosen to place his name, to put his name. At first it was back in Shiloh, later it was in Jerusalem. Now, Revelation 22:4, his name is in your forehead. You are the temple, he's put his shingle out, you are his street address. You are the temple of God, don't you know? And if you know who you are, that you are a temple of God, that he is indwelling you, you don't have to go someplace for a feast. You don't have to go to Jerusalem anymore. You don't have to go to Salt Lake City. You don't have to go to Springfield. You don't have to go anywhere, because where you go is irrelevant from that standpoint other than divine leading, because he might want to lead you to a particular place for some prophetic reason. But to keep the feast, you have to keep it here. Same with Pentecost. You don't have to offer 2 loaves of bread baked with leaven anymore. No, you are the Pentecostal offering, and that's why the fire of God came down and accepted the offering in the book of Acts with tongues of fire on their heads. He accepts the offerings by fire. Tabernacles is the same thing. So anyway, in Exodus 12, it tells you the qualifications of how to become the sons of God. And then in chapter 13, it really continues, because it wasn't until the 13th century that they divided up the Bible into chapters and verses. A guy named Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury. And so, anyway, it makes it convenient, and you might even say it's inspired, right? 999th chapter of the Bible, right? It's kind of strange. God is in everything. But Moses didn't write chapters and verses. All he did was give speeches, so you have section 1, section 2, speech 1, speech 2, speech 3, and of course, I've got some books on that. Now, when you get into chapter 13, and this is a continuation of the instructions for Passover. In fact, even in verse 6, it says, "For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall," and it keeps talking all about Passover, all the way up till verse 10. "Therefore you shall keep this ordinance at its appointed time from year to year." And then what is the first law that comes in after this? And it's really very, very pertinent to what Passover is all about. It says, "Now it shall come about when the Lord brings you to the land of the Canaanite, as he swore to you and to your fathers, and gives it to you, that you shall devote to the Lord the first offspring of every womb, and the first offspring of every beast that you own. The males belong to the Lord, but every first offspring of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. But if you do not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. And every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem." Why did all the firstborn sons have to be redeemed? Because they're a bunch of donkeys. If they were the sheep of his pasture, they wouldn't have to be redeemed. Right? Every firstborn of a donkey you have to redeem with a lamb. And all of your firstborn you have to be redeemed. Well, duh. So, the question, you see, is how do we make that transformation from donkey to sheep? It's a lawful matter. It's a matter of law, not a matter of genealogy. The donkey will always remain a donkey. A lamb will always remain a lamb. But how do you turn a donkey into a lamb? You say it is, and it is. Okay? You are who you say you are in that sense. But how do you do it? What is the mechanics of this? What is the spiritual law here? Because you know, Paul tells you in Romans 7:14, the law is spiritual. So we're not talking about spiritual Israelites here. We're talking about legal citizenship. But that is spiritual. So it is spiritual Israel. Okay? It's a spiritual process. Of course it is. Because it's not biological. You have to have standing in the divine court, your relationship with God has to change. You have to go from donkey stage to lamb stage. And how do you do that? It's by redemption. That's why when Israel came out of Egypt, they had to keep Passover because they were all donkeys and had to be redeemed with the lamb. And when they were redeemed with the lamb, then that's when they became the sheep of his pasture. Otherwise, they're just the donkeys of his corral. Right? Did they change their appearance? They changed their skin color? Did suddenly they have no hair or all of their hair on their head? No. Nothing changed genetically, but their legal standing changed. And this is a very important principle. This has many applications. Because if you don't do this, your neck gets broken. What does that mean? It's the stiff-necked people whose pride and the rebellion has to be broken. It was called a stiff neck. Not a chiropractic term. It's a spiritual term. Spiritual chiropractic, okay? And so, but breaking that neck, that's usually what happens when you're in the wilderness. The Lord does something to you. You become a different person. Well, Eli, for instance, was a heavy donkey, if you remember. And he fell backward and broke his neck. Right? Ron calls him a fat ass. But anyway, he likes King James. I usually go with the New American Standard. It's a little more proper. But anyway, I like to be proper, I guess it's the British in me. But anyway. Okay, the thing about Passover is that it breaks a curse. Okay, it breaks a curse. Yesterday we talked about Ishmael and how Ishmael was brought forth into the world specifically in order to be the chosen seed, right? Abram thought, Sarah, you're barren, so, can't have any kids, past childbearing age, so, the promise must be fulfilled in another way, so we'll take Hagar, we'll bring forth a child through her, and he will be the chosen seed. But the angel told Hagar that your son is going to be a wild ass man. Genesis 16, I think it's verse 16 also. New American Standard calls him a wild ass of a man, which is, it's just parei Adam, and parei is always a wild ass in Scripture, wherever it's translated, except for that one spot. We're going to have a great transformation of Democrats one of these days, at the appointed time. Anyway. So Ishmael was brought forth, and he was called a wild donkey because he had Abram as his father, but Egypt as his mother. There's a mixed bag there, okay, spiritually speaking. And so what Abram did on a personal scale, God did on a national scale a couple of centuries later. So God, the Father, took Egypt as his wife and brought forth Israel as their firstborn son. Okay? And God didn't seem to care that Egypt was Egypt. You might say that was the first bride of Christ. Ooh. That's heresy in some circles. But anyway, I'll just say it. Just saying. But you see, when that happened, because Egypt was Israel's mother, Israel was going to be born as a spiritual Ishmaelite, being a wild donkey. That's why they needed to be redeemed with the lamb and come out at Passover after they had kept the Passover the previous evening. They could not leave Egypt as donkeys. God said, no, you're going to leave as my firstborn sons, but you got to be lambs first. So you have to take this Passover first and then come out. So you're coming out as a sheep of my pasture, or as the firstborn. Make sense? Now, so you have to relate this story back to Ishmael and realize that this was the end of a 414-year cycle from the birth of Ishmael to the Exodus. Okay? 414 years. Ishmael was put on cursed time, not because of what he did, but because of his parents did. They attributed to him a calling that was not his. And that calling, great as it was, became a curse to him because there was no way he could fulfill it because he was not really called. But he was made responsible to fulfill the calling of the firstborn Son of God. There was no way they were going to do it because they were not called. Ishmael was in a calling that was not his, and it put him on cursed time. And by extension, Egypt was on cursed time as well. By extension, because Ishmael was the grandson of Pharaoh and was basically a half Egyptian, and being in a position of royalty, he really put the whole nation of Egypt on cursed time. Strange thing enough, Egypt did produce the firstborn Son of God, but actually all they could do was produce a donkey that then had to be redeemed with a lamb in order to make them acceptable. Now, here's what's really interesting to me. There was a mixed multitude of Egyptians, primarily, who came out of Egypt with them, right? That's in chapter 12, verse 38. And a mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. Well, where did they go to? I believe that at least the majority of them kept the Passover with the Israelites. By this time, after 9 plagues, they were starting to develop a little faith, right? They were starting to realize that maybe the gods that they had been worshiping weren't such gods after all. They worshiped frogs and lice and flies and cats. They used to worship cats in Egypt. Cats remember this. Any of you had cats? Yeah. They remember. But God brought judgment on all the gods of Egypt, not all of them, but a whole bunch of them, by basically plaguing the Egyptians with their own gods. You know, God does this kind of thing. You want to worship a fly? Fine, I'll give you a whole bunch of them and see if you like it. You want to worship frogs? Here's a bunch of them. And it's like, oh, take these away. You see? God doesn't make you do anything. He just makes you willing to do something. Right? It gives you a belly full of what you want. Your own desires, your own fleshly desires and heart idolatry becomes the curse, which then makes you want to give them up and destroy. Let's get rid of these gods. They're no good. We don't want any more. He loves to do things like that. And so when you have a bunch of these Egyptians who are starting to get enlightened and realize there's a God here that is a whole lot bigger and stronger than our stupid little gods over here. And so when they hear that you got to keep this Passover and do these strange things, otherwise your firstborn son's going to die, some of them were thinking, do I risk this or not? There are a bunch of them that came in and joined with the Israelites and ate the Passover lamb, I believe. And they were then justified by faith in the blood of the lamb. And as wild donkeys themselves, as Egyptians, they were then redeemed with the lamb as well. So they became the sheep of his pasture as well. Their legal standing changed. Their relationship with God changed. They went from an idolatrous system worshiping false gods to the true God. Now, they didn't know a whole lot yet, and so they ran into some problems and they grumbled and complained, a lot of them did, in the wilderness. That's true. But it didn't mean that they were not part of the church, because the church is the congregation of Israel. They were part of it. Got a lot of complainers in the church, by the way. In fact, we all go through that stage. To complain is to be a good Hagar. Because, if I recall, the Hebrew word Haggah, which is the basic, it means to complain. Murmur. The Israelites were murmuring in the wilderness. It showed that they were of Hagar. You see? Their hearts weren't really changed. And so they proved to be continuing as children of Hagar, spiritual Ishmaelites, rather than true Israelites. And this is what Paul tells us in Galatians 4, where he says the earthly Jerusalem that now is Hagar, and answers to the old covenant. If you're old covenant, you're part of Hagar. If you're new covenant, you're part of Sarah. Sarah's your mother, not Hagar. Can you really switch mothers? Well, yes, you can. The Apostle Paul shows us how to do it, because he did it. He had been a child of the old Jerusalem, persecuting the church, and suddenly he got turned around, and he switched mothers and claimed Hagar not to be his mother, and claimed Sarah to be his mother from then on. And he wrote about this in Galatians 4. So there is a way to transfer your genealogy from, especially your mother. Now, the father stays the same, but the mother is different. And I found that a good share of the church today does not understand this, and so they think that they are new covenant, but actually in practice they're old covenant Christians. They think that they are the sheep of his pasture, when in fact they are donkeys in disguise. They think that they are going to inherit the kingdom, but they claim Jerusalem as their mother. That's the mother church. We're all going to go to Jerusalem. The kingdom is going to be established there. Going to build a physical temple, have animal sacrifices, and do all this old covenant stuff, because the age of grace is ending, and now we're going to go back into the law, by which they don't mean the actual fulfillment of the law, which is good. What they mean is we're going to go back under the old covenant. And that's the problem. They should be keeping the law and rejecting the old covenant. Instead, they keep the old covenant and reject the law. I don't understand this. It made perfect sense when I was growing up, because that's what I was told. Not in those words, because they really didn't think they were doing that. But that's the way it is. And the whole view of prophecy, where they think that Christ is going to come back and rule from the old Jerusalem, tells you that their model is that they are trying to honor their mother, Hagar. They don't know the difference, because even though everybody has Galatians 4 in their Bible, and they have all read it at some point, somehow it just goes over their head. And I know because it went over my head for decades. It took a long time for me to see it and realize, hey, wait a minute. I have a lot of those aha moments. Anyway, so to come out of this cursed time of Ishmael has to do with you transferring your identity from a donkey to a lamb. And we talk about the two identities, the flesh and spirit, that which we are born with from Adam. The overall picture of Adam, the Adamic flesh, leading to the sons of God, which is being birthed through the seed of God, where you become the sons of God, where you basically change fathers, and you go from the first Adam to the last Adam. All of that is a long-term process, and ultimately it takes 6,000 years and even more to fulfill that judgment cycle. That judgment cycle is that you are enslaved for 6 days or 6 years, according to Exodus 21, and that turns out to be also 6,000 years. Okay? And so that is a very, very long-term cycle, judgment cycle. But within that context, you have smaller cycles, which we call 414 years or multiples of it. And so you see pieces of that or smaller pictures, which gives us more details about what it means to be under the curse and under the blessing. How do you get from one to the other? What's really interesting is that Daniel's 70 weeks, which is 70 rest year cycles, 70 times 7, which is 490 years, when the angel came and told Daniel about the 70 weeks have been determined, it kicked in 458 BC, some 70, 75, maybe 76 years after Daniel got this. That's when the calendar actually picked up again. And it was not the edict of Cyrus, it was the edict of Artaxerxes of Persia. And this occurred in his 7th year, which was 458 BC, established by astronomy, by the way, and eclipses and all that. So this is a fixed year, absolute, you can't change that. 490 years later happened to be 33 AD. The edict was made in the first month of the year in the spring. Jesus died in the first month at Passover. 490 years later. Well, 490 is what we call blessed time. That's not 414. Jesus did not die on cursed time. He died on blessed time. Very interesting, because this blessed time is about transferring us out of cursed time into blessed time, which is your position as sons of God. So it tells you something about that. If you look at the chronology prophesies into this story. It makes it very meaningful and interesting. So the question is, how do you get off cursed time from Adam? Well, it's the same as getting off cursed time from Ishmael in Egypt, because Egypt represents the world. When we come out of the world, we come out from the donkey stage into the lamb stage, then we are justified by faith in the blood of the Lamb. And that is our justification. It's by faith. It's not by genealogy, it's by faith. And this is Paul's big deal, especially in the book of Galatians. Okay, so we come out of Egypt. We're firstborn sons of God now. We've got our right standing before God. But we still haven't established the kingdom. So we come to Mount Sinai for Pentecost, 7 weeks later, or thereabouts, and now we have a Pentecostal situation to deal with. It's the next big stage of development, not only personally, where you go from justification to sanctification, or from getting saved, getting filled with the Spirit, however you want to put it. These are two different experiences individually, but also in the big picture. you might say a church picture, if you use the word church. It's a congregation, it's a corporate unit. And here at Mount Sinai, we again run into a problem, just like they did back in Egypt. Okay? Back in Egypt, most of the Egyptians did not put the blood of the lamb. They did not have faith in the blood of the lamb, and everyone that did not lost their firstborn. Everyone who did came out of Egypt, they didn't lose their firstborn. They became the firstborn. You see that? That's why the majority of the Egyptians were judged. They fell because it was the end of a 414-year cycle, and so the debt note came due. So that which happened with Ishmael way back earlier was then, that debt note was paid for by the existing Pharaoh in the time of Moses. And by that time, of course, after 414 years, nobody makes a connection. Unfortunately, nobody ever learns the lesson then, because they never do the chronology and they never understand what cursed time is. But we know, we have some idea here, because the Lord has given this revelation to us. So we can learn the lessons that they did not learn back then. Just by learning these lessons enlightens us in so many ways, so that it teaches us what we can do, and it lights the path that we can follow. So now we come out of Egypt and we go to Mount Sinai for Pentecost. And here we find that there's a Pentecostal curse too. Not just, or, well, I guess I could put it another way. Passover was the resolution to a previous curse. Pentecost is the resolution to another curse. Okay? It's the next step up. It's a curse really of not being able to hear God's voice, and you end up in rebellion or revolting against Him, because to hear is to obey. The Hebrew word Shema is translated in two ways. Both are correct. To hear, to obey. Hear, O Israel, you could translate it, obey, O Israel. Either way, it's the same Hebrew word. And so, but here at Pentecost, you're moving past the faith stage. Now you're moving into the obedience stage. You're learning obedience. Obedience does not justify you. Passover, or faith, justifies you. But what comes after justification? If you're just content to get, I got saved, in 1990, on a particular date, you got it all written down. Now I got my free ticket to heaven, and that's the end of it? Really? No. There's a whole lot more. There's more to coming out of Egypt than just coming out of Egypt. You can't just leave Egypt. You got to go somewhere. It's a journey. The journey will always take you through Mount Sinai for Pentecost. Pentecost is the next big step toward Tabernacles, which is when you're supposed to go into the land and inherit. And so, you know the story in Exodus chapter 20, where God told the people, God told Moses to tell the people, hey, come on up here, the fire's nice, nice and warm, beautiful fire. Nobody likes the fire. Oh, no. You go up there and hear God, and then come back and tell us what He said. It's safer down here. Fear of hearing His voice prevented obedience, because to hear is to obey. If all you want to do is hear Moses, then you might obey Moses, but you're not hearing God, and you're not really obeying Him. You will always misunderstand Moses if you don't hear God. That's the deception of this. We think, if we just memorize this law. And the Jews did. By the time they were 12, 13, they had to memorize this law. But did you understand it? You don't understand it unless you hear God's voice in it. And that's where the problem is. And so we have to break that curse as well. And there is a curse that came through King Saul, who was the type of Pentecost, since he was crowned on the day of wheat harvest, which is Pentecost. And just before he died, he consulted the witch of Endor, which put the whole monarchy onto cursed time until the time of Jehoiachin, who went captive into Babylon for 37 years, and then he was reinstated, and the king of Babylon raised him up and blessed him. And he became then a type of the overcomer, transferring from a prison cell to a stage of ruling and reigning. And so, but again, that's at the end of a 414-year cycle. It's like, if you don't know this chronology, you'll never make the connection between these events. It's cause and effect. A time cycle gives you cause and effect. Okay? And of course, our time is running out, but there's also the Jubilee cycle and the Feast of Tabernacles, which is typed in Numbers 13 and 14, when the Israelites refused to go in, except for Caleb and Joshua. Once again, you have a division of people. Some people enter into tabernacles, and others end up into further processing in a judgment cycle. In their case, 40 years. The more we learn about these things, the more prepared we are if we want to be inheritors of the kingdom. You have to be part of the Isaac company, not Ishmael. You have to be the lamb. And remember, Isaac was offered as a lamb on Mount Moriah. If you're not willing to die, you might as well go home. You can't be raised from the dead unless you've died first. Paul says, he that is dead is justified from sin. You can't get away from death. It doesn't mean you have to go shoot yourself in the head. It just means you have to lose your own will and recognize he is sovereign. He is Lord. Okay? Okay, thanks.